Landry.Audio. Today we're with journalist and author Peter Hitchens. Peter writes for the Mail on Sunday. We'll be talking about his opinions on politics, law, the state, religion, and his relationship with his late brother, fellow author and journalist, the late Christopher Hitchens. He's been good enough to join us from his home in London today. So how are you, Peter?
Well, I'm not at home. I'm in the office.
Oh, fair enough. Okay.
No, I don't live in London. I fled London many years ago. I didn't want anyone to have the false impression that I was the kind of person who could afford to live there.
It goes along with some of the things that I've read about your opinions on rural England and urbanization. So where do you base yourself out of these days?
I live in Oxford. I've lived in Oxford for more than 30 years.
Excellent.
And indeed, I lived in Oxford before then. I'm an Oxford tanny from more than half a century ago. It's my, I won't say it's entirely my favourite place in England, but it's certainly the one where I feel most safest from the storm of the Cultural Revolution.
Fair enough. Well, we lived out there for a couple of years. We ended up basing ourselves in London, but for the first 6 months before, my wife works in healthcare. Before she could get a transfer, she was at the it's not within the town centre. It's the other major hospital, the John Radcliffe Hospital. Yeah, so she was there for a number of months. So we'd be there quite frequently on weekends. So excellent. Well, look, we've got a number of things to talk about today. I think for some of the people who would listen to this, that they're going to be very interested in your late brother, and of course, I'd really like to speak to you about your column with the Mail. You're noted for being quite a conservative columnist, and I think that presents a lot of interesting talking points about your opinions on where we are today. But look, you mentioned that you're still based in Oxford. I believe that your brother went there as well, so that's probably the best place to start.
I never went to university there. I only ever lived there.
Right. Okay. Well,
as I say, I'm an Oxford townie, not part of the temporary population that comes and goes.
Okay, fair enough. So, what was life like for you growing up?
That's such an extraordinarily broad question. I mean, I survived it without any serious damage. I have no complaints about it. It wasn't particularly shocking or surprising in any way. I wasn't physically or sexually abused. I received something approaching an education. I didn't fall victim to any serious diseases. But I've got no complaints. I would not make a very good misery memoir.
Fair enough. And so how does that play in with your brother? Because when I was looking at a little bit about this, because I'm familiar with both of you, but you guys, outside of, I think, your personal religious beliefs, there's a similar sort of evolution and thought of where you guys came from and where you ended up on the political sphere. But in the interviews that I've seen and during his lifetime, it seemed like there was quite a battle of the minds for a long period of your upbringing together.
Yeah, I mean, I can't. It's impossible for me, honestly, to discuss this in vague terms. I've talked about it a great deal in one way or another, but I really do need people to put specific things to me for me to come up with any kind of answer. To just go on vaguely about it is almost impossible for me and probably very boring for anybody who had to listen to it. If you can be specific, I'll answer questions. But if it's general, I just find it very difficult to generalize about it.
All right. Well, where I wanted to start then is, as I said, your position, or where you're known for in the media these days, is being a conservative columnist. And it was quite interesting for me to find out that in your younger days you called yourself a revolutionary socialist. The first portion of that question is I oftentimes have a difficult time understanding the nuances between terms associated with that, which includes, communist, Marxist, Stalinist, Trotskyist. So could you just sort of take us through your beliefs around this time period? Well,
I embrace the classic Bolshevik position. That is, I believe that the society had reached a stage where the current order, economic and political, social and cultural, needed to be overthrown. That the old bonds of marriage and family needed to be got rid of. That the whole economic basis of life needed to be transformed into one aimed at the general good of people rather than driven by capitalistic profit. And also I was very much against the existence of national borders and nation states. And the method adopted was the one which had been popularized by Lenin in 1917 with the astonishing success of the Bolshevik Party in overthrowing the provisional government in Petrograd and creating the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But on the other hand, I also believe that the USSR had been a disastrous failure, which was evident to anybody who looked at it, and disowned the Stalinist era, which was why I was a Trotskyist, believing, as many revolutionaries liked to do, that if only the leadership of the Bolsheviks had been different, things wouldn't have turned out so badly. That's a simple summary of my position, but the revolutionary attitude towards the whole of society was complete. As I say, it embraced everything from family life to sexual relations to the nation state to the nature of criminal justice and personal responsibility. I was a completely left-wing person with wholly left-wing opinions.
How do you, at the time, I guess a little bit younger, so I don't really remember communism, the Cold War. While this was going on, how did you sort of
that young?
Reconcile? Well, I'm 37, so by the time 91
I suppose it is
hit,
drifting into the past. I always thought the Disney Corporation should have bought East Germany and kept it going, because otherwise it would become impossible to explain to anybody how bad it had been. And I think this is now happening. People just no longer have any clue as to how ghastly the whole thing was. But sorry, I've digressed, or made you do so.
No, that's fine. I'm interested because, as you said, we're losing this period. So outside of my own studies, there were a few units on it while I was going through schools, and then as we have seen now, it's sort of there's the people that live in the West, in the greatest countries in the world, are now adopting these more and more as positions. So that's sort of why I'm asking you about, how did you sort of reconcile that belief, or what was your opinion of?
Well, so how do I reconcile what?
Your left beliefs at that point in time, when we've got things like the Cold War going on, or
well, as I say, what we said was that the Russian Revolution had gone wrong, that Stalin had perverted it, that he'd effectively created what we'd regarded as more or less a counter-revolution, had destroyed the old Bolsheviks, and had trampled on all kinds of ideas which would have allowed a much greater measure of freedom to survive. And also would have avoided the Great Purges, and would also have been more economically and socially successful. And we believe that the USSR could have been a successful experiment in revolutionizing human society if only Stalin hadn't defeated Trotsky in the factional struggles in Moscow in the 1920s. And so this is I'm telling you what these beliefs were, not what I now believe. But that is why Trotskyism exists as a very, very large political tendency on the left, because of the revolutionary socialists, in very few cases, were prepared to accept responsibility for the Stalin regime and what followed, and most of them wanted to disown in some way or another the USSR. I mean, I have met and indeed know quite well and quite like some absolute Stalinists who were completely and utterly convinced in what I now look back and see as a much more principled way than mine was, that what they had done was necessary, and that therefore it was justified. I don't believe that to be true myself, but it seemed to me to be the only actually properly consistent revolutionary position looking back on it, and one which I certainly wouldn't have had the stomach for at the time, and I don't have the stomach for it now either. But the great luxury of Trotskyism was that it enabled you to continue to be a revolutionary while disowning the almost inevitable effects, in fact, the inevitable effects of all revolutions. As I say now, to the point of tedium, utopia can only be approached across a sea of blood, and you never arrive. But I didn't know that then.
And so is it pretty fair to say then, when we talk about the left and their communist utopia, then that they would broadly be categorized as Trotskyists then?
I think it's certainly the 60s version of revolutionary socialism, which I embraced, was largely Trotskyist, even when they were members of the actual official Communist Party of Great Britain, which still took large wads of money from the Soviet Union. They used to leave them in tube stations in London in plastic bags. Even though they still sort of vaguely defended the USSR, most of them had very considerable criticisms of it and made them increasingly publicly because they recognized it to be a disaster. In fact, this goes back way, way beyond the 1960s. The original ultra-intelligent communist who understood that the Soviet experiment had been a disaster for the left-wing cause was Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist. whose ideas were just beginning to spread out beyond a very small circle at the time when I was a revolutionary. They've become much more widely known now, but he had visited the Soviet Union, I think, in the 1920s, realized it was a catastrophe, that the Western European communists would never succeed if they modeled their movements on the Bolsheviks or tried to copy what the Bolsheviks had done, and put forward a wholly different idea, which can basically be summed up in a much later slogan, the Long March Through the Institutions, the change of the culture, which is what the left was actually beginning to turn to during my time as a revolutionary, and has now wholly turned to. So they simply gave up the idea that the working class trade unionists would storm the barracks and the police station and the railway station and take over the world on their behalf, because that obviously wasn't going to happen. And they embarked on a profound and widespread cultural and moral revolution instead, which has been almost wholly successful, largely because very few people have noticed it.
And you're talking about sort of realizations in it, but was there a particular instance, or when did you begin to lose faith in the ideology?
Oh, well, for goodness sake, everybody does that. It's almost it's a cliche of human existence and of the past several hundred years that young men are revolutionaries in their teens and 20s, and then later they realize that real life conflicts with their revolutionary fantasies, and they give it up. And that's what I did. The question is not one you should put to me. You should put it to those people who are now in their 50s and 60s and indeed 70s, who had revolutionary ideas in the 1960s when in their teens and 20s, and still do. And these are also people who still go to Rolling Stones concerts despite their paunches and bald heads and cram themselves into jeans as if they were teenagers. Why is it that everybody else did not grow up as I did? I just did the ordinary, cliched, boring, predictable thing. It's the others who've done the bizarre thing of continuing to be revolutionary into their pensionable years.
Fair. And I remember reading this. You had said that you wanted to be a journalist to be able to continue this on. And one of the things that was interesting to me is, from what you had said, you were actually based in Moscow during the last years of communism. Is this correct? You were.
Yes, I watched the whole thing fall over. Yes, and collapse in a great cloud of rust. Yep, but I was not by then any kind. People often misunderstand this piece of personal history to think that it had some effect on my view of communism. I had long abandoned socialism as a political belief before I ever went near the Soviet Union. And I certainly didn't, nothing that happened there changed my mind about how repulsive I found communism. What it did do, though, was it educated me in how very much more communism had been than simply the nationalization of all industry and the secret police. It was the huge assault which it had made on family and private life, which I hadn't fully understood until then, and which I then found was taking place in my own country when I returned to it.
And can you tell us a little bit more about this time in Moscow and what you noticed? Because this is, I would not have.
It's not particularly interesting. I mean, I saw what everybody saw. I saw a great failure, an enormous, gigantic economic and political failure tottering on its last legs. And there have been millions of descriptions of it. I didn't see anything different from what anybody else saw.
In a separate interview, you discussed the hostility to religion in Soviet Russia as well. I've sort of heard about these things in communism. What was the great threat, or what was the theory of why someone shouldn't be able to have their own personal beliefs and faith under the system?
Well, it's supposed to go back. If you're the people who examined it from a philosophical point of view, say it goes back to the philosopher Helvetius, who pointed out, I think it would have been in the 18th century, that if you believe that man was made in the image of God, then you couldn't simultaneously believe that you could remake mankind. Now, all the revolutionaries of modern times, really since the French Jacobins, who came out of French thought in the 18th century, have all believed they could begin the world over again and create a new type of man. And that obviously completely conflicts with the rather pessimistic idea that we are as we are, that we cannot be changed, and which comes, apart from anything else, from one of the most profound beliefs of the Christian religion, which is that man is made in the image of God. Therefore, any attempt to change man is not merely blasphemous, but impossible. So that couldn't coexist. And I think fundamentally that's the point at which the two beliefs of Christianity and of utopian revolution diverge. Because one proposes, say, an earthly utopia, which is created by a total overturning of all institutions, customs, and morals. And the other says, no, there is no such thing as an earthly utopia. There's a kingdom of heaven which does not exist in this world. As Christ says, my kingdom is not of this world, and people can't expect any kind of perfection to exist in this world, nor should they do so. It's a blasphemous thing to do. So the two things are utterly opposed. And therefore, all serious revolutionists have seen the Christian church and its thinking as an obstacle to be overcome. The first real vicious state assault on Christianity, I think, that was recorded was the de-Christianization of the Jacobins, led by Fouché, who deliberately desecrated churches and installed prostitutes on the altars and destroyed before their eyes the beliefs and reverence of the French poor, so that they could never properly recover their Christian beliefs again. And very successful it was. And the state of Christianity in France now, I think, owes a great deal to what the Jacobins and Fouché did at the end of the 18th century. They dealt a mortal blow to Christianity from which it's never recovered. Other things have happened since, but that was the start of it. And the Bolsheviks took very much the same view. You may find quite a lot of Christians who imagine they're socialists. You may even find some Christians who are sympathetic to communism, but you will never find a proper communist who doesn't hate Christianity.
When you started your journalist career, I believe that you said there's one book that you need to read. I know your brother was also a fan of it as well. Can you explain to me the influence that George Orwell had over you?
Well, George Orwell was a revelation to me. When I left my private school and ended my ordinary conventional private education at the age of 15, we came to a mutual disagreement, and after I was caught trying to break into a government fallout shelter one summer afternoon, and I went off to a college of further education, which was regarded as very much not the thing, where in fact the syllabus, particularly for English, was much more modern than the one that I'd been studying up till then. I was introduced to terrific good fortune to George Orwell beyond Animal Farm and 1984, which everybody knew about. Even in my private school, we knew about that. But I began to read Orwell's essays. And it was a revelation to me that somebody could have these thoughts. My rejection of my past had been a large part of my becoming a revolutionary. I'd been deeply disappointed. I'd been brought up as a Christian conservative in what I believed to be a Christian conservative country, probably to serve that country as I had hoped to do in some way in the armed forces. My father being a naval officer, I very much wanted during my childhood to be a destroyer captain, which seemed to me to be the pinnacle of human activity, and found early on that I couldn't be because I had an eye defect which prevented it. But also, I increasingly found that the country which I'd hoped to serve was not the one which I thought it was. I was growing up during the Profumo affair, during which our whole ruling class was made to look ridiculous by its absurd sexual activity. And then the satire boom, during which everything was debunked. And, of course, in the aftermath of the Suez disaster, which everyone now forgets, I can just remember it. In October 1956, I was 5. I can just remember the word Suez crackling out of the old brown Bakelite radio that my father kept in the bathroom while he shaved in the morning. I can also remember an extraordinary thing of my father, a naval officer with gold braid all over his uniform, getting an ancient bicycle out of the garden shed to ride down to the nearest railway station because there was no petrol for the car. He couldn't get to work.
Right. And
naval officers in those days did not ride bicycles. It was not something they did. And it was quite a shocking thing to see. And it was what had happened at Suez was a total shock to the confident conservative middle classes. They suddenly realized we weren't an important country anymore. And the shock continued. And the Suez crisis and Profumo had completely and utterly destroyed my belief in the sort of country that I imagined I was living in. And you could feel that authority had lost its grip. Lenin once said, it was one of the cleverest things he said, if you stick in the bayonet, if you meet steel, withdraw and try again somewhere else. But if you meet mush, keep pushing. And I was a difficult child. I found that when I came up against authority, increasingly I met mush. People didn't stand up for the things they were supposed to. And so you lost respect for the vicar and for the policeman and for the school teacher and for every figure of authority. And I felt lost, as people often do when authority is gone. I needed something else in which to believe. And when revolutionary socialism came my way in the late 60s, I embraced it with great enthusiasm because it filled the hole left by the collapse of my patriotism and the Christianity I'd up till then learned. It provided everything, and that's why I did it. So that was a large part of how I came to be where I was.
You view a lot of personalities and events in a very different light than...
Well, I just going back to Orwell just for a moment, because
yes.
That was the point at which that began. The point about George Orwell was that, and particularly in things which absolutely... I look now at my very old, faded, falling to pieces paperback editions of Orwell's collected essays, and they're scribbled over with notes and exclamation marks and underlinings, often in faded red ink. And the essay called "The Lion and the Unicorn," about written during the early years of the First World War, which was an extraordinary synthesis of revolutionary leftism and patriotism, was the thing which really appealed to me. I thought, well, it's not actually impossible to have the sort of fundamental, unforgotten beliefs that I have about England, and also to be a revolutionary socialist. And this was hugely important to me. The other thing about Orwell was that it was quite evident that he could write. And I thought that his simple rules, as expressed in the wonderful essay called Politics in the English Language, although nothing is perfect, it has its faults, were rules which everybody should try to follow. And I go back and read it every few months, and I find that I've been slipping away from its rules myself because they're hard to do. But it contains really the 10 Commandments of good writing. And I was slightly puzzled when later in life my brother turned out to be an enthusiast for George Orwell, because I didn't realize that he had been, but I had been completely besotted. You look at my old collected essays, from which I bought out of my own meager funds in the 1960s, and the spines are cracked or anything, and the pages are loose. I read and soft. I read that over and over and over again because it completely altered my life. And if I hadn't come across it, as I say, as part of the English A-level course, which I was doing at the College of Further Education in the 1960s, I don't think I'd ever have got there.
Mm. If you were talking about your desire for a military career, and I thought that was a good segue when we're talking about sort of your opinions on a lot of the conventional knowledge and how you don't share that about a lot of events. And you have some pretty interesting opinions on both the First and Second World War, and you've written extensively about this. Do you want to, in particular, the First World War and the decline in religion? This is, it's a century before I was born. So
yeah, I have tried so much. When I first read about the First World War, interestingly enough, at one of my boarding schools, there was a very good place to hide from authority because nobody ever looked in there. It was the library. And I spent a lot of time in there dodging things which I was supposed to be doing, which I'm very good at. And one of the things it contained was a complete set of bound volumes of the magazine Punch, which was sort of humorous but also quite serious, and contained, amongst other things, a lot of very fine cartoons in the days when cartoons were beautifully drawn in great detail, like Bernard Partridge. And from them I learned a great deal of history, and it was evident from me in reading these that the world which had existed before 1914 was completely different from the world which existed afterwards. And I became very struck by this, and I felt actually that I rather preferred the world which had existed before 1914. It seemed to me to have been headed in a different and preferable direction to the one which came afterwards. So I already had that idea very much in view. And then as I came in history to study the First World War, it seemed to me that the arguments that Douglas Haig had been an incompetent butcher and that the war had been the most tremendous moronic waste of human life was indisputable. And I've read the revisionist historians who try to claim that actually this wasn't so, and I cannot be persuaded by it. And the other thing I can't be persuaded by is that there was any reason whatsoever for Britain to enter that war, and I still can't work out why we did. I've tried and tried. Again, if you read Barbara Tuchman's still superb account of the outbreak of war, the Guns of August, it's plain there was a very small group of people in Britain who were determined to embroil us in what was effectively a Russo-German continental war, and they succeeded in doing so. And nobody in the country really understood at the time what it was about, let alone expected that it would involve us in having huge million-strong armies entrenched across the whole continent. Most people thought it would be a naval war for us in which we would stand off it. And people lied about it, and the churches lied about it from their pulpits. They said it was a war for civilization. Indeed, my great-uncle's war medal, which I still have somewhere, has inscribed upon it the words very deeply, the Great War for Civilization, which was one of the things it was called, and the other thing it was called was the War to End War. Well, it was neither of those things, and these were lies, and it was patent to everybody who'd taken part in it, and especially when the wounded came back, and indeed the unwounded came back as well with their accounts of what had actually happened. The difference between the official propaganda and the fact was so enormous as to be absurd, and people just knew that they had been fed a lie. And it was catastrophic for the Christian religion, and indeed, I think, for respect for almost all our institutions, that they'd all said this war was a marvelous thing, and it had not been a marvelous thing, and we ended it impoverished, and we ended it diminished, and we ended it short of a whole generation of our best men from every class and every corner of the country, just massacred, and it just was a catastrophe. And the fact those who had supported it and praised it as a war for civilization looked very foolish and had lost forever their authority. And since so many of them were ministers of religion, it began the long process of the emptying of the churches, which is now almost complete.
So you think that there remains a lack of trust with that authority in the post-war years? What was the war to you before then? Because you say, I much rather would have liked to live in that time. What is that?
Well, I wouldn't prefer to live in that time. The past is irrecoverable. What one always has to do when one looks at the past is to see how things would have been different if we'd chosen a different future. Now, if in 1914 Britain had remained neutral, as the United States did, and as Switzerland very sensibly did, and had stayed out of it, it would not, ultimately, our imperial dominance was already on the slide, and so was our wealth, but we would not have become a pensioner of the United States, which we did, I think, in late 1915, if I remember right. It was a wonderful book by Adam Tooze, Tooze, called The Deluge, in which this process, which is the best by far history of the First World War, in which this process of self-subjugation to the United States is described. And the amazing thing about it is we got very deeply in debt to them. The amazing thing about it is, and this actually angers people, and they deny it furiously when you say, we still owe the United States billions of pounds from the First World War. We never paid it off. And people say, no, we did. And I say, no, you go and ring up the Treasury, and they'll tell you we still owe this money. We haven't paid a penny of it since 1934. And by the enormous piles of gold are still owed. And that was the point at which, of course, we ceased to be a creditor country, which we'd been before, and became a debtor country with much less freedom of maneuver both at home and abroad, as we have been ever since. And what we also did, of course, was destroy huge numbers of our markets, our foreign investments, and at the same time we began to lose the influence which we previously had, and it's the beginning of it.
And then you go on to effectively say, or I'm paraphrasing it from what I can recall, I remember, is that England is effectively dead after World War II. There's a lot of personal beliefs that you have about the Second
World War II is a different. It's not. England was not effectively dead after World War II. England is effectively dead now. I regard myself as its obituarist, but after World War II, it was by no means dead and could have recovered as a major country, reasonably prosperous and free with a future to it, but it chose so many mistaken roads and paths particularly in the 1960s and afterwards, that I don't think that will ever happen now. I think it's chosen the downward path, and one which will get steeper and steeper as the years go by. But the Second World War was inevitable after the First World War, because the First World War left the business unfinished. There was a problem which is actually was bound to exist and which required a solution, which was Germany was bound to dominate Western Europe because of its size and its wealth and its industrial power and its culture and everything about it. There was, particularly after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Germany was going to dominate Europe. And the only question was how. But rather than thinking about this, I think Bismarck at one stage went and visited Britain and was astonished at the total ignorance of Europe among senior British politicians. They knew everything you needed to know about India, but nothing at all about Germany or France. And they formulated their policies on the basis of a vague belief that if they spoke and intervened, it would all be Napoleonic Wars all over again, and Britain would triumph and we would get our way. But because we didn't, because Germany had by then become so immensely powerful, the question was really how to accommodate it, which was not solved by the First World War, because Germany was neither completely crushed and destroyed, which is not something I recommend, but nor was it deterred from the belief that it needed to have more territory and more power. And so it was going to come again, even if there had been no Hitler. There would have been a later confrontation in Germany. If you look at many, not all, but many of Hitler's foreign policies, they were not that different from those of the democratic leaders of Weimar Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s. There would have been a confrontation coming, and it was just a question of how it came. But when it did come, my point about the Second World War in my book, The Phony Victory, is that the way in which we and France entered it was an extremely foolish and dangerous one, which very, very nearly got us occupied and defeated.
What do you think about Germany now? They're responsible for the first two wars, and I think with a number of factors that could sort of become the crux of perhaps a larger war.
Germany is definitely responsible for the First World War. I know Fritz Fischer's book seems to be unequivocal and unchallenged on this. The Germany contrived a war in the belief that it could, through that war, obtain the dominance which it sought, and knock France out, do serious damage to Russia, take away large portions of what were then Russian territory, and move into the Balkans, and possibly in the end attain a unification of Austria-Hungary and Germany and the dream of Mittel Europa, which they had. That, I think, was what they were hoping for, and that's why they contrived the war. The Second World War, I think, Hitler undoubtedly wanted a war with the Soviet Union, because the real key and core of German foreign policy had always been Ukraine, and control over it, which is still an issue in Europe now, and to some extent also control over the Baltic coast and over the Caucasus, and the Balkans, which are dependent parts of any serious policy towards Ukraine. But I don't know whether he would have been particularly interested in a war in Western Europe unless one had been offered to him. So we don't know whether the Second World War in the form that it took was inevitable. I think undoubtedly there would have been again a Russo-German war or a Soviet-German war by 1941 or 1942, whatever had happened. But the Stalin-Hitler Pact postponed that and made life a little more complicated. But if you want to go into it in detail, I have written a book about it, which I can't possibly summarize in a few words. But what is fundamental about it is, two things I'm not saying. I'm not saying Britain shouldn't have fought against Germany. I'm not saying that Hitler shouldn't have been destroyed, because I believe that Hitler should have been destroyed, and I think Britain should have fought at some point against Germany, but I don't think we should have fought at the point that we did, or on the pretext which we chose. And also, I don't think that the general British attitude towards the war, which was an unmitigated triumph for Britain, in which we emerged superb and resplendent, is correct or sustainable. It isn't true. We had all the aspects of a defeated country after the war, except we hadn't actually been defeated.
Only because you had briefly mentioned it, and you know that region well from staying there. What do you reckon about Putin and Russia and this sort of rebuilding as they invade, Georgia and eastern Ukraine?
The thing you have to remember about Russia is that it has approximately the gross domestic product of Italy.
Yes.
And a heritage set of unusable nuclear weapons, which give it an importance way beyond its true economic or political weight. Russia is a country in decline, a declining population. It's the inheritor of the remains of a destroyed and demoralized empire. It's also the inheritor of 70 years of Bolshevik misrule, which led to the most dreadful corruption and social damage, which will take centuries to recover. Russia is a wounded, unhappy, poor, bruised country, which is being treated as if it's an expansionist power, and it reacts badly to that. Having lived in Russia, I don't think, as most Western people do, that it's a weird place full of snow and icebergs with polar bears roaming through the streets and where they use a funny alphabet. I think it's an important European civilization which is entitled to some self-respect, and which has many, many reasons to be worried about its future. And I'm just amazed at the crass stupidity with which we treat it.
Well, let's bring that back to your country now, because you have been noted and you've...
But you ask me any detailed questions about supposed Russian aggression, and I'll explain to you that there is no such thing. because there isn't any.
Okay. The decline of England and the UK, you've already touched on it, but when do you think this happened? You said it's an obituary, so it's long past its breaking point. I guess, do you want to just explain that and talk about what do you think the country is today then, and where's it going?
Well, what is England or Britain? I mean, Britain is really constructed in 1707 with the Act of Union with Scotland. And I don't want to forget Wales, but it's not nothing like as important. And later on, the attempt to unite the whole kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, which ended, as we know, with a large part of Ireland breaking away. But England, what is it? England is Magna Carta and the amazing separateness from continental law, which resulted from that, the actual genuine freedom of the individual, the growth out of it of jury trial, the true presumption of innocence, of the early abolition of torture, the creation of habeas corpus, and the end of arbitrary imprisonment. The increasing limitations. I'm very much a Macaulay person. The beginning of his great history of England, in which he describes the difference between Britain and the continent, still seems to me to be valid. I know it's much criticised now, but it accords with my experience of my own country. An extraordinary level, both of freedom and of consciousness of freedom, absolutely reaching its peak, I suppose, in the 1689 Bill of Rights, which is the model of all documents which restrain the state. The whole point about the Bill of Rights is it doesn't contain all kinds of airy rights to privacy and whatever else other which can be interpreted as nothing but judges. It says the government cannot do this. The king may not do this. The courts may not do this. Parliament must be protected from this. The people must be free to do this. It even gives me, as a Protestant, the freedom to keep weapons. It's a charter of limitation on government. So a whole wonderful idea of limitation on government, and all this surrounded by a tremendous naval tradition of being willing to defend the seas around our country and therefore to make us invulnerable from foreign invasion. That is the combination. There's thousands, nearly 1,000 years of personal liberty under the law. Moderated by a particularly clever, after the Reformation, version of Christianity, which had survived pretty much untroubled for several hundred years until 1914. And since then, the ideas which sustained it have largely died. Most people, I find, under the age of 60 or 70 are almost completely unaware of our constitutional and legal heritage. They don't even know we had a prime minister recently who'd never heard of the Bill of Rights and who didn't know what Magna Carta meant. Just for instance, people don't know. They're confused about the nature and origins of it. They don't know the vital texts of their own culture. They don't know the authorized version of the Bible. They don't know Shakespeare. It's like Russians not knowing Tolstoy, which Russians tend to do. They don't know anything about themselves or their past. They don't know their poems. They don't know their music. They don't know their landscape. They don't know their geography. They don't know their history. They've been robbed of all that. They're a bunch of amnesiacs roaming around in an island which was once Great Britain. But unaware of the fact that that's where they live.
At its core, like, when do you think this? I mean, you say World War I, but it seems like it's a more
nothing
recent
has
phenomenon.
a single cause. Each of these things, comes bit by bit and slice by slice and episode by episode. And we did actually engage in the most fantastic act of self-destruction when we destroyed our state education system in the 1960s. And we have never recovered from that, and we never will, unless and until we put it back. But
could you explain that to me? What does that mean?
Yeah, we had a system of what we call grammar schools, it means a completely different thing in the United States, but in Britain what they were in many cases, they're not all, schools of long histories, which after the 1944 Education Act provided, day schools, non-boarding schools, provided an education of very high quality to anybody who could pass a generally fairly simple examination at the age of 11. And these were state schools open to everybody who was able to do that, selective on the basis purely of ability. There are criticisms of them, which we could argue about, but the fact was that what they provided a level of education so high that in the 1950s, I can remember in the early 1960s, it's still being said that a set of English A-level examinations, that's the school-leaving exams, which people took either at the end of their secondary education or when they were about to go to university, were considered to be roughly the equivalent of an American university degree. And there was also a thing called the brain drain, where the United States was constantly hiring people with vast dollar salaries to leave Britain to go and work there because their own education system simply wasn't producing the people they wanted. It's comical to imagine anyone doing that now. These schools also, they kept the other schools on it, particularly the expensive private schools which existed alongside them. And they were all destroyed. There's a rump left behind, but they don't function as a national system anymore, so they don't have any effect, for instance, on the design of the curriculum or the exams, and they just have to tail along behind examinations designed for people who are much less well educated, in which their pupils can easily score incredibly high marks because the exams are so easy. And we destroyed this in an act of political egalitarian frenzy between about 1965 and about 1975. With both major parties taking part, and any attempt to actually restore what was lost is always met with howls of rage from all corners of politics, and so it never happened. It's it's the devastation of our education system, because oddly enough, the standards of the grammar schools to which the people who passed the exam went kept the standards of the secondary modern schools, the other schools, higher. Than they would otherwise have been as well. They kept the whole education system honest, and once they were gone, there was simply no benchmark, and everything just was entered a period of inflation. The British examination certificate is very much like the German 10 million mark banknote of the 1920s. It's full of grandiose claims about what it's worth, but actually you'll be lucky if it buys you a potato.
There's two questions that sort of spin off there, which is a good place to start. You talked about all these historical documents, and the Magna Carta and the rights of man. One of the
the rights of man, no, that's the other lot.
Sorry, the Americans, yeah. Sorry,
the rights of man. The rights of man is the French, being utopian and saying man has all these airy, vague, grandiloquent rights. Which, of course, then have to be interpreted by the courts and mean, in many cases, that if you try to assert them, you get guillotined. So I'm not a rights of man person. I'm a Bill of Rights person, which is the whole point about the English Bill of Rights is it says government cannot do this, the king cannot do this, the courts cannot do this, they must not do. It's limitation on power. And that's what Magna Carta is as well. It's a limitation on the royal power. It's the subjection of power to law, which is the key to freedom and one of the rarest things in any human society.
So I've read that you still share a lot of sympathy, like with the trade union movement and ensuring jobs are domestic for the workers. But
why shouldn't I? I mean, it always amazes me that the political accommodation, which was partly achieved by Charles de Gaulle in France, of patriotism at home, a strong defence abroad, and great concern for the condition of the poor at home, why this extremely civilized and sensible political position doesn't have a political party which represents it anymore. Why wouldn't I? If you love your country, you love its people, and you don't want them to suffer unnecessarily from poverty or homelessness or disease or anything. You want to put that right. And some form of social democratic welfare state seems to me to be a very workable way of doing it. Oddly enough, Otto von Bismarck discovered that in Germany because he did it out of purely cynical motives, as he did many things to head off social democrats who were advocating the same thing. But it is important, and if you want a unified country, and a country is the largest political unit in which it's possible to be effectively unselfish, so you ought to want one, then these things you have to do. And as for trade unionism, I was in Gdansk in 1980 when Lech Wałęsa and the Solidarity Trade Union were defying with astonishing, almost unimaginable courage the entire might of the Soviet Empire. And that was a trade union. So how could I support Wałęsa in Gdansk and not also see the point of trade unionism in my own country? It's an important part of freedom. If people at work have no access to collective bargaining and nothing to defend them against employers whose interests aren't always the same as theirs, then where are we? It's an absence of freedom, isn't it?
So where do you think the role of government should be today then? Because what I'm trying to get at is...
The role of government should always be on the most fundamental is the maintenance of the rule of law at home. And I mean the rule of law, that is to say law is more important than power, that there is ultimately equity in society, and that be never so high, the law is above you. And the maintenance of the national defense abroad, so that your borders or your coasts are safe from invasion and you control who comes into the country. Those are the most fundamental things. After that, there are other things where it is sometimes politics intervene and sometimes not. For instance, I'm very much in favor of nationalized railway systems. I think the power generation works better if it's a national enterprise. Obviously, the armed forces have to be national enterprises, though I know there are supposed libertarians who believe otherwise. And as I say, I think in a modern society it does become essential to have some sort of welfare state, but it has to be based on distinctions between the deserving and the undeserving. You can't just give out. You can't support deliberate idleness. You have to find some way of making sure that people will work unless they can't. But if they can't work, then they should be supported to the utmost. So those are the fundamental duties. And I personally, again, I'm in favour of some sort of national health system. I wouldn't necessarily choose the one which Britain now has as the model for it.
All right, let's go into immigration. I don't think I need to ask any more. I'm sure you'll tell me.
Well, ask a question.
Well, I mean, when you talk about those sorts of things, what's interesting is the levels of immigration, like post-war and where we're at today. Where for myself in Australia, I think we're getting about 3% immigration per year, and it's just questions about the infrastructure. You seem to be a big man on culture. So, what are your sort of opinions on?
Australia is a very different country from Britain,
sure.
And I think that probably Australia could do with having a bigger population than it has in a lot of ways. The question, therefore, arises as to how you increase it. Britain, I don't think it's already incredibly densely populated in its populated areas. And the thing you have to understand about Britain is that so much of its life and activity is now concentrated in the southeast. And there are large parts of the country which are very beautiful, but are unlikely ever to be urbanized. It would be a pity if they were. So in simple terms of density of population in the areas where people can find work to do, it's already very high. We also have roughly 1 million young people who are known as NEETs, not in education, employment, or training, who have come through, what is it now, at least 11 years of formal education, in many cases unable to read, write, or count, and certainly not attracted to any employers. So we have difficulties there, which some people have sought to overcome by importing better educated young people from foreign countries. And you can't blame them. I mean, one of the great from the consumer point of view, one of the great changes in Britain over the past 20 years has been the arrival of lots of young men and women from Poland, who are, although they don't, to begin with, speak English, are much more in demand among employers than many of their British equivalents, which is an interesting thing. But it's reasonable in a country such as ours for people to say, well, actually, maybe we should have some migrants. But the reasons why we have the migrants don't tend to be reasons of real necessity, but reasons resulting from foolish policies which we've adopted in the past, in undermining education and undermining family life and pretty much destroying the institution of husband and father, which for young men has been, I think, particularly catastrophic and led to an awful lot of unemployability. So we've tried to cope with that. There's also been a big economic change since we more or less destroyed our industrial manufacturing base in the Thatcher period, and people have been flipping around trying to work out what sort of economic model we should go to. And I think it's the belief in government, though no one ever says so, that we should go for a low-wage model, and instead of having been a relatively skilled, high-productivity, high-wage economy, become a lower productivity, low-wage economy, which does seem to me to be happening quite fast. And of course, for that, you need more and more people. And I think both the Labour and Conservative governments of the late 90s and early part of the 21st century would never have admitted to it, but I think they were probably quite happy to see a pretty large influx of migrants. And the problem with this is, of course, that however nice they may be, migrants tend to head for poorer areas of the country. They tend to do the work of the poorer, less privileged people. And if they arrive in very large numbers, it's extremely difficult to integrate them. And so they form solitudes within your society, where a different language is spoken and a different culture is followed, which mean that your culture is and the unity of your country are both undermined. And that has been a problem very much with immigration. And the other thing, of course, is that I mentioned earlier on, seen as a consumer, these things were great. And many of the wealthier people in the southeast of England saw very much the arrival of large numbers of migrants as a way of obtaining cheap servants. They won't call them servants. They call nannies or cleaners or whatever it is, but servants as they are. Or alternatively, the cheapness of the restaurants they run or of the services they provide. They benefit from that. But of course, that's one way of looking at it, but it's not the way of looking at it. If you live in, say, a medium-sized town in the east of England, which suddenly has a very, very large population of people who don't speak English, whose children are going to the schools and who are using the medical services that and the roads and competing for the housing and the jobs that you have, and it's not necessarily going to be popular. And that's been one of the reasons for the political troubles which Britain finds itself in. Migration is no country can survive without a certain amount of migration. And migration has, on occasion in the past, done a great deal of good to most of the countries which have experienced it. But the problem is, if it happens in very, very large quantities, it's extremely hard to integrate, and the danger actually of ethnic conflict increases, it seems to me, if you don't integrate. And the larger the influx of migrants at any one time, the harder it is to integrate. And I think we've been following a policy of extreme rashness on that basis in recent years. And it's only, I think, because the British are, for the most part, extremely tolerant and patient people, very ungiven to outbreaks of the sort of violence you see in some places, that it hasn't had much worse results than it has had.
You seem to have clear-cut opinions on everything, but on this one, you're listing the pros and cons of it at the same time.
Well, I have clear-cut opinions. I wouldn't say I haven't listed the pros and cons. I explained to you at the beginning of our conversation the reasons why I was a revolutionary socialist. It seems to me to be pretty much giving the pros and cons, because I'm certainly not one of them. I would hope that I could see both sides of any question. It seems to me to be the duty of any thinking person to examine the opponent's case before dismissing it.
Well, one of the things that comes up, I guess, flowing on from this, you talk about the diminishing role of the husband and the male in the household, and younger people always talk about areas like inflation, where a single bread earner would be able to provide for his family. Now it seems that younger people can't even afford an apartment somewhere. Do you have particular opinions, or with your knowledge of history of inflation?
I could go on for all day about the many faults and failings in my country. I think there's been grave mistakes in housing policy, but I think inflation, of course, emerges from the fact that we live consistently beyond our means, and we do not pay for our imports with exports, and haven't done for a very long time. The government can't make ends meet without borrowing every year. So that, and the inevitable result in even the most basic economics will tell you, of ceaselessly spending money that you don't have, is that there will be inflation, and the value of money will fall. It isn't as evident from national statistics, in my view, as it ought to be, because inflation is often targeted. And for instance, if you're the kind of idiot who saves money in modern Britain, then you are targeted by a particularly virulent form of inflation, because there's no interest paid on your savings. And so you're giving huge amounts of money away every year in inflation by leaving it in the bank. Or alternatively, thanks to quantitative easing, you can put it in risky investments, which may well destroy the whole thing. But it's not. That's one form of it. Other forms, of course, are the comically absurd price of houses, particularly in southeastern England now, which almost nobody can afford. Most people I know live in houses which they could not now afford to buy. So what is sustaining these prices? And the only thing that sustains them is the fact that actually house prices are the true measure of inflation. And if all those houses suddenly went on the market, if anyone actually tried to test the value of those houses, it would collapse. But the people have borrowed in many cases so much money on the value of those houses that would lead to an economic collapse. And this is one of the reasons why I say that Britain is on the edge of a catastrophe because so many economic indicators are so bad and show no signs whatever of improving, and nobody is doing anything to improve them. That all it will take is one really major shock, a sledgehammer blow at one of the pillars of it, and the whole thing will come falling down. But yes, it's incredibly difficult for young people to find places to live. This is a fruit of not merely of inflation, but of deliberate government policies which flooded the housing market with money. Margaret Thatcher's much lauded policy of selling off council houses, public housing, cheaply to tenants. And it was a great vote winner and all the rest of it. Basically, it was giving large amounts of money away to people, which, of course, went into the housing market. And it was creating a wave of money. I remember because I was trying to buy my first property while this was going on. A wave of money sweeping through the housing market, which meant that you might go and view a property on Monday, and you think, well, I might be able to afford that. And you go back on Wednesday and say, no, actually, it's gone up by £2,500, which in those days was a lot of money, and I couldn't afford it. And it just constantly, inflation was dragging property out of reach, and that's because this wave of targeted inflation was unleashed on the housing market for political reason. So there's been a lot of that, and I'd say we could occupy the whole day going through the mistakes made by various governments over the past 30 years. That was undoubtedly one of them, and there was also a government subsidy through taxation of the buying of houses. Which again meant large amounts of money being targeted into the housing market, which inevitably pushed prices up. I'm not an economist, but you don't have to be an economist to see the failings in these policies.
For a lot of people who may not know you well, they only know you as a conservative. It's interesting that a lot of the traditional conservative figures, including Thatcher, you're not a fan of. I assume that's
Thatcher wasn't a conservative.
Okay,
Thatcher was never a conservative. What was the political party of her adored father?
I don't
the
have
great Alderman Roberts. He was a liberal, and so was she. And she was a liberal, and so was Ronald Reagan. These people were not conservatives. She may have had vaguely conservative opinions on social matters, but she never did a conservative thing.
Well, this is interesting to me then, only because these are the people that are held up as the bastion of
I know they are,
conservatism.
yes, and it's a big mistake. That's why I keep writing and saying, no, actually, if you note, Thatcher and Reagan were not conservatives.
But she's still loathed by the left as well, so where does she sort of fit in?
Well, but the problem is the political discourse in the Western countries is at such a pitifully low level. I think you actually have to have been a Marxist-Leninist to understand politics. And most people haven't been. And so if you don't, then you just miss what's going on. And the idea that Thatcher was a conservative is as absurd as the equally absurd idea that the Blair government in Britain was right-wing when it was the most revolutionary government Britain had since Oliver Cromwell. But actually, you have to understand what's going on to see these things. It's knowing, understanding, having traveled the world, knowing any history, having a basic understanding of politics is a positive disadvantage in political discourse in modern Britain because everybody thinks you're mad. And particularly on things like Russia or Syria and things like that. The things that people think and believe are just so hilariously wrong that you have to make a huge effort and take several deep breaths before you can reply to them.
So would there have been a leader, or I guess a conservative leader, or someone that you would have, I guess, appreciated or approved of at some point within?
Not that I can think of. No, the Conservative Party has never been a conservative party. It's a name, but it's not a fact. When I grasped after my return from the Soviet Union, a sort of gradual re-entry into British politics and British political journalism, when I grasped what was going on, I immediately launched a personal campaign for the destruction of the Conservative Party and its complete eradication, which was a total failure. But that seemed to me to be the only sensible conclusion which any conservative could come to from examining the state of modern Britain. The thing which absolutely had to go was the Conservative Party because it occupied the space which was needed for a proper Conservative Party.
So how does that impact then from the outside?
Say the same for the Australian Liberal Party.
Well, yeah, but from the outside look at you then had UKIP, and now Farage has moved on and he's got the Brexit.
But UKIP was never a political party. UKIP was a sort of, I suppose you could call it a movement. But it was never intended to, as far as I could see, nor did it ever show any sign of replacing the Conservative Party, nor was UKIP particularly conservative. Nigel Farage is in favour of the decriminalisation of drugs.
Mm-hmm. Which I know you're not.
Well, he's not conservative.
So what do you think that does for them? And I guess probably a better segue to that point then is when we talk about Brexit. I think like the climate change argument, a lot of people are just exhausted by this now. With the UK enters the European Union in 71 or somewhere along that time, and they now want out.
72 was the formal treaty. 73 was the factual entrance.
71, 73. There's now a referendum.
72 was the signing of the treaty and the legal taking on of the passing of the legislation. But the actual entry in physical terms began to take effect 73.
And from what I have read, you're not really a fan of referendums either, or don't put.
No, I think in Switzerland they're all right because the constitution allows for them, and because they can only take place on petitions of the people, and they're not a government device. But in countries such as Britain, they are extremely dangerous because they undermine parliamentary sovereignty.
And you would have voted to stay, or what's sort of your opinions on it?
I didn't vote. I refused to vote.
Right, okay.
I refused to play any part in it. I thought the whole thing was wrong.
So what do you think about it now?
I feel very smug and vindicated about that.
and where it's left off. I'm asking you to sort of clarify all the massive misinformation that I read from different
it's not. People on both sides here don't understand it. There are two great books on the subject. One written from a left liberal point of view called "This Blessed Plot" by the late Hugo Young, and the other called what did he call it? The Great Deception. Christopher Booker, my friend Christopher Booker, who, to my great sorrow, died very recently, and his colleague Richard North. And these are the two books which explain, first of all, how it happened, and secondly, what it was. And they're both very, very good. Neither of them is hard to read. And if you've read them, then you understand what the issues are and what the European Union actually is, and what its intended future is, and also by implication what leaving it would entail. I've seldom met either a journalist who writes about it every day, or a member of Parliament who speaks about it all the time, or a minister concerned with it who's ever read either of these books. They haven't got a clue what they're dealing with. It's like hiring someone to fix your wiring who doesn't know anything about electricity, or somebody to fix your water pipes who isn't a plumber. The whole thing is being tackled by people who haven't a clue what they're doing and don't have any idea what the consequences of their actions are going to be. It's painful to watch. Again, I'm not some kind of brilliant polymath or detailed historian, but a lot of people until very recently didn't even understand the difference between the customs union and the single market. They don't know what it is. They don't know what a non-tariff barrier is. They don't know what the European Union's origins and purpose is. They don't know why it came to existence. They don't know what its inevitable development will be. They just don't know what it is. And yet they've suddenly, after years and years and years and years, I and a few other people said, look, really much better off if Britain were not in this thing. And I said, oh, yawn, boring, stop banging on. And most of those people who said, oh, yawn, boring, stop banging on, are now passionate to the point of fury to leave. And I'm just amazed at the sudden emergence of all these fanatics on a subject on which they previously couldn't have cared less, when it might have been some use if they had cared. They leave me behind. They're so much more ferociously in favour of doing this thing to à l'outrance than I, who've been in favour of Britain seceding from the EU since 15 years, and that it just never ceases to astonish me. I mean, several of the leaders of supposed Brexitism in Britain, that's a word I try very hard not to use, such as Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, were to my certain knowledge for many, many years keen supporters of our remaining within it. Yeah.
Right. Well, ultimately, what do you think will happen out of this?
I have no idea. I see nothing but tragedy ahead because, as I said, what happens if you get a person who doesn't know anything about plumbing to fix your pipes at the same time as you call in a man who doesn't know anything about electricity to fix your wiring? What do you think will happen?
What do you think about
hot jam will come out of your telephone? Probably. It's just so completely and utterly unpredictable as to what will happen because people are taking actions whose consequences they don't know and don't understand. They're fiddling with devices. They don't know how they work. They don't know whether the switch means up when it's off or down when it's on. They have no idea which way to turn the tap. And these are the people in charge of it. And so how can you tell what's going to happen except it's not going to be good? I've given up, and I just laugh.
I wanted to ask you as well about Churchill because again. I know, he was a liberal who then went conservative, but again, he's another person that's sort of held up as a key conservative, as the savior of Britain. But you're also quite critical of him as well.
He wasn't ever particularly conservative.
Well, he wasn't even with the Conservative Party originally. He's flip-flopped back and forth.
There's no congruence at all between the Conservative Party and conservatism. I mean, I can't see any connection between the two things.
What are your primary?
And when did the Conservative Party ever enact a piece of conservative legislation, or indeed oppose a piece of radical legislation? I can't think of an occasion. And maybe the Duke of Wellington, possibly. But it's as a party, it does not do what it says on the label. It's like buying a bottle with a label that's saying red Burgundy and opening it and finding you've a bottle of beer. It's just not. It's just mis-selling. If it were in any other walk of life, it would be against the law, but they do it.
One of the things that was most shocking to me on the outside, you were talking, when we talk about the ability to have free speech and rights and things, is reading about the police cracking down on offensive social media tweets and these things that seem to be jailable offenses.
Free speech is already a dead letter. I mean, I have a certain amount of free speech because I'm a national newspaper columnist, and therefore I have a license to speak more freely than most people. But if I worked in any kind of public sector employment or in any private sector employment which is dependent on the public sector, which is most of it, I'd have to watch my lip. It's very dangerous because the way in which speech codes are enforced is through threats to employment.
But even people seem to be doing this privately.
People will not speak out against the speech codes of equality and diversity.
And that seems to be what I'm reading.
They're against them.
Literally, if I'm told someone was jailed for the fact that they inferred that a transgender person was not actually transgender. I
haven't heard of anybody being jailed for that. I mean, my argument is that these people are much too intelligent to imprison people for this sort of thing. That what they do is they threaten their employment, and that's how it happens. I mean, these things generally come to employment tribunals.
What do you think about other pop culture figures that have sort of taken the mantle on either the left or right? In particular, in the UK, I want to mention Tommy Robinson, who seemed to be a fringe character who became a national figure over the years, and I'll also mention a guy like Jordan Peterson, who is considered conservative by some people.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've written an essay. I reviewed his book, 12 Steps to Wondrousness, or whatever it's called, in case of Jordan Peterson, and I was not overwhelmed. I'm not quite sure. I know he did make a noble stand against speech codes in Canada, for which he must be applauded, but I can't see anything particularly conservative about what he said. Although I think an awful lot of what he says is gibberish. But Robinson, whose real name is Yaxley Lennon, let's put it like this. I don't think anybody should take him seriously as a political force or somebody offering a political argument. But there is something extremely frightening about the support which he is sometimes able to get.
And why is that?
No, I think I'd rather leave it at that, honestly. I mean, I'd need to have all kinds of legally cleared pieces of paper in front of me before I discussed Mr. Yaxley Lennon in any detail anywhere in public.
Interesting. Okay. Look, let's get on to your faith. I think that's an interesting thing. Again, not a lot of people that I hear that go from atheist to being a believer. I guess the first thing is...
Really? Yeah, that's quite common.
Is it? Okay, well, maybe... I'm sure we just hang out in different circles.
I don't know. It's like the old left-wing person becomes conservative thing. And people in life become... And the famous John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, is one of many well-publicized examples. I think it's that uncommon. Again, it's the life teaches you the often quite painful lessons which maybe your school failed to teach you. You learn that these things are important in a way which you didn't previously realize. It's a cliche, surely. It's
a fair assessment. But was there a moment for you then?
No, no change of mind comes in a moment. The change of mind is something which you resist, in some cases for years. You half know because you conceal from yourself that beyond that door, whose handle you could turn and open, lies a world in which you will lose large numbers of friends, quite possibly lose your job, certainly undergo a complete change in your life which might not be welcome, which you can avoid by simply shutting up. So people don't.
And how did you decide? So when you decided to get involved?
I didn't know those threats. I know my job wasn't threatened. I did nothing of that kind faced me. For me, it seemed to me that if I were honest with myself, then this was something that I had to profess.
So people can have faith.
Also, it seemed to me as it seems to me now. It seems to me to be true. This is belief. It's not knowledge. I cannot know that it's true, but I feel I have a very profound feeling engendered from whether it be the observation of the world around me, or the reading of poetry and literature, or the listening to music. And one of my particular favorites, losing myself in the great art galleries and cathedrals of Europe, it seems to me that there is an enormous, persuasive, non-verbal argument for the existence of God, and further than that, for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So for these things, I am persuaded in a way which I don't attempt to communicate to other people because it's so personal. But I just am, and that's how I feel. And I didn't find that there was anything in reason or fact which stood in the way of that, and therefore I felt that there was really no excuse not to embrace it. For me, I never attempt to persuade anybody else of it. If people attack me, and if people jeer at me, and atheists come along and say this, that, and the other, and your brother was much cleverer than you, or hogwash, which I get hosed down with on Twitter, then I will defend myself again.
Yes.
But I won't. I don't proselytize. I think God would probably not want me to go around saying to other people believe in God. I think the most guaranteed way of persuading people not to do so would be having me standing on street corners yelling at them to get their minds right.
How did you decide to become a Protestant?
Well, I already was one. I mean, my whole culture and upbringing and background was that. I couldn't have been anything else. In the England in which I grew up was profoundly, instinctively Protestant, and it still is the case. I couldn't imagine being, if I were, I couldn't imagine being anything else as an Englishman than a Protestant.
So I guess I'll take the conversation.
I reckon I was a Protestant even when I was a Trotskyist.
From more from I guess your personal relationship with the belief in anything then, but I guess what's always held me back is a lot of the questions around I guess trying to look at it rationally a lot of the time. So when you look at
reason will not take you to religious belief. Reason will not take you any further than Gnosticism. There isn't. It simply won't. You can't do it because there is no compelling, there's no factual proof one way or another. There is no you can start with all these ontological stuff, but nobody who doesn't already believe in it will ever be persuaded by an ontological argument.
Oh, but I mean, just in the context of Protestantism, for an example, that's a relatively new faith that's come through the monarchy.
Well, that may seem that way to you, but it doesn't seem that way to me.
Okay, in what way?
In what way? It's in the landscape in which I live. It's in everything from the weather to the architecture and the music. That's just how I feel.
Could you not have potentially become? Well, I guess
I
you said it's
been.
culturally
in theory, if
Roman Catholic
brought
or
up
something.
that way, I could have been a Muslim, but I'm not. So it's not very important, really, is it?
Interesting.
I mean, I wouldn't want to persuade anybody else out of any religious view that they have, and I resist with some brutality any attempts by anybody to do the same to me. If you want me to block you on Twitter, try and persuade me to join the Roman Catholic Church. That'll be goodbye forever.
Fair enough.
It's just so bloody rude. It's none of anybody's business what I believe.
Well, I mean, you wrote a book about it, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I wrote a book about it. I didn't write a book about what I believe actually at all. It barely says what I believe. I wrote a book about why atheists were not entitled to tell believers that they were stupid. That's what the book is about.
So
I got tired of that. I got tired of being told, "Oh, if you believe in God, you must be stupid," because it isn't true. And I wrote a counter to it. I didn't offer anything else. A lot of people wrote, "Oh, this is Hitchens has written this book about God, and it doesn't. It's completely without any theological content." And I said, "Great! It was the whole point."
Well, let's
search it in vain for any theological content, but what it basically says is this is the nature of the rage against God. This is what motivates it, and but it's based on a number of fatuous and it was an anti-atheist book. It wasn't a Christian book.
Okay. Well, that takes away quite a few of my questions then. But
well, then good. That would probably spare us a lot of trouble.
I guess what we'll begin to
Don't
wind.
Ask me about, no, I won't say that. But yes. Come on.
There's just a few questions about rationality, but you've already addressed that. You just said, look, it's really a matter of faith, and you have to put it in that context. And so,
yeah, you do. I wouldn't try to communicate it to anybody else, and I'm not, and I don't propose to argue with anybody about it.
Fair enough.
Now or later.
I did initially ask about your brother at the start, and we kind of moved on and talked a lot about other things. Between Christopher's beliefs and yours, I believe there was a time where you guys weren't speaking, then there was speaking. You guys went on debates.
Well, he wasn't speaking to me. I've cheerfully spoken to him. I mean, he loved rows, and he decided to have one, so there we were. It suited him at that point, I think, to have a row. But it was nothing. I mean, to me, it wasn't. I don't even believe it was of my making. If you want the story of it, it's this. Many years ago, he came to dinner with my wife and me in our tiny Oxford home. It must have been the early 1980s in the Reagan era, and there was all this stuff going on at the time about the installation of cruise missiles and Pershing II missiles in Europe, and the nuclear disarmers were making their usual ludicrous pleas for this not to happen, so Union could be the dominant power in Europe. And at some point in the argument, quite late in the evening, Christopher said, "Well, I don't care." He had a way of saying these clever things. "I don't care if the Red Army waters its horses at Hendon." And a few years later, we were both in Washington, D.C., and we were on a C-SPAN program with Brian Lamb, and I brought that up and reminded him of it, and he just laughed. And then in 2001, just after September the 11th, I wrote a piece for the Spectator magazine in London about the extraordinary transformations of many political positions by the September the 11th outrage, and devoted quite a bit of it to Christopher's sudden conversion to American patriotism. And I remarked that I remembered him once saying that he didn't care if the Red Army watered its horses at Hendon. And I sent him, in fact, in advance of publication, I sent him a copy of this. And I got back this stinging email saying, "That is a lie." I knew it wasn't. I was quite confident he said it, and my wife clearly, right down to the tone of voice in which he said it, which she can do beautifully. And I thought, well, what can one do? And there wasn't any negotiation left when someone says that's a lie. I said, "I'm sorry, it's not." And I almost wished I hadn't done the courtesy of sending it to him in advance. But anyway, he then decided to make some various rude remarks about it in public, and wouldn't speak to me or communicate with me for some time. And I think I may once or twice have defended myself in public, but not much because people didn't ask me. And then eventually he was persuaded to drop it, and he made an approach to bring an end to it, which was fine by me, because I would have brought an end to it the following day if I'd been able to. But no, I didn't have a row with him. He had a row with me. He had a row. Probably the nicest human being in the world is James Fenton, the poet. You may or may not know. You ought to know his work. He really is a very fine poet, and he's one of the friends of Christopher who I always most liked. And Christopher managed to make a row with James over the Falklands War in 1982, which you would have thought was impossible, because it is almost impossible to have a row with James, but he did. So he would have a row with anybody. And had one with me. And there we are. I should be honoured.
And how do you... I guess this is probably a good place to finish off our chat.
We were never friends, so we were brothers, and it's quite different.
How do you remember?
I don't know whether you have siblings.
No,
some
I'm
people
single.
they have different experiences. Some people, some people really get on with their brothers and sisters, and some people don't. And I would cheerfully have gone on with him, but it wasn't really that mutual. So there's no point in pretending that we were bosom buddies or anything. We got on. I think to an extent we respected each other. We stayed to a great extent out of each other's lives until, by completely different routes, we both reached this level of journalistic minor celebrity, and he then became a rock star. And that complicated things a bit more.
Well, look, I really appreciate your time today, Peter.
Yeah, there you are.